Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment in the speaker series of Kluger Institution's project on China's global sharp power. Today, our guest is Professor Ying Zhu, currently a professor at Hong Kong Baptist University, where she directs the Center for Film and Moving Image Research in their Academy of Film. She's also a professor emeritus at the City University of New York. Professor Zhu is an accomplished scholar of Chinese media. Among her most recent contributions that will be of interest to this audience, she was the co-editor in 2019 of an excellent study, Soft Power with Chinese Characteristics, China's Campaign for Hearts and Minds. And she's the author in 2015 of 2 Billion Eyes, the story of China's central television. She comes to us today with a preview of her latest book entitled Hollywood in China, which offers a panoramic view of the exchanges between Hollywood, the Chinese film industry, and the governments of the two nations over the last century. The book is scheduled for release later this summer. For those of you in the audience, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, as we will have a Q&A portion at the end of her talk. Professor Zhu, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. And I'd like to thank Glenn and the whole institution for inviting me to talk about the Sino-Hollywood relation based on my new book, Hollywood in China, and here's the plug. So Glenn asked me to chat a bit about China's global influence pertaining to cinema and the motion picture industry. And before I get to the part about influence, it is imperative that we trace the origin and evolution of the linkage between film industries and national governments, which I cover in my book. Within the context of Sino-US, as it is kind of discussed in the book, it took some lobbying effort from the film industries, from both the Chinese and US governments, to see the potential of motion picture for cultural influence, political persuasion, as well as consumer product promotion in the case of Hollywood. And once caught on, both governments sought to capitalize on the power of cinema. So film was one of the biggest and the most glamorous influencer since the early days, to use the modern lexicon. While the US government functioned mostly as a facilitator for the growth and international expansion of the American film industry, as it relished Hollywood's effortless charm in showcasing the American lifestyle and consumer products abroad, the Nanjing government under the KMT, the Kuomintang Nationalist Party, was more meddlesome, prone to regulating content, yet offered very little financial support to the struggling Chinese film industry. Hollywood's dominance in China during the Republic era put the beleaguered Nanjing government on defense. The Chinese reacted passive-aggressively towards Hollywood's popularity in China, and also Hollywood's perceived China offense on the image front. The PRC era would usher in a decisively more proactive approach in eradicating the US cultural presence, indeed banning Hollywood films altogether during the Mao era. And the post-Mao era has witnessed a kind of considered effort from the Chinese government in utilizing Hollywood to its own advantage in both image lifting and marketing, market building, which has now put the US government in the defense. So in a way, history has come to a full circle. And the history of Sino-US relation is what my book captures. My book basically charts 4 major phases in the Sino-Hollywood relation, spanning over a century, dating back to 1897, the year when the first batch of US motion pictures appeared in China, brought over by James Riccarton, an American photographer from befittingly New Jersey, which is the birthplace of American film industry. Riccarton presented a few Edison films, including Nicholas II visiting Paris at a tea house in Shanghai. He kind of continued on as a photographer in China and later recorded Boxer Rebellion of 1900. So my book divides the span of over 125 years of Sino-Hollywood relation into these four phases. Now, most of us think about the international film trade in terms of movies and tickets, how many domestic films are released each year, and what share of total box office receipts goes to foreign versus domestic films, etc. However, this is interesting. In the early days, a more common way to keep tabs on the film trade was to simply tally up the total length of exposed film each year. A raw measure to be sure, but one that served well enough during that time. And in one of the books, the American scholar Carrie Seagrave goes to this early record to compare length. Hence, you have this very convoluted chart. And the numbers reveal a footage race that began with entrants from around the world competing on a very kind of level playing field until World War II intervened and the world hobbled film production nearly everywhere except the United States, allowing Hollywood to take the lead and run with it. In China, Hollywood took up to 80% of the market during the Republic era. Now, the founding of the PRC in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 led to a wholesale ban on all things American, including Hollywood pictures. Though the ban was not without trepidation from the party leaders who had private misgivings about an outright ban, with the concern that such might provoke an outcry from the fans of Hollywood pictures, particularly in China's cosmopolitan urban centers, such as Shanghai, which is the birthplace of Chinese cinema. It was a high time for the party to woo the urban dwellers for the purpose of maintaining stability in the newly founded People's Republic. And the Yankee pictures served as pacifiers. And one twist is that, as I uncovered in my book, though the official ban on Hollywood would last throughout the Mao era, that runs from 1949 to 1976, there was actually quite a number of Hollywood-led Western films circulating unofficially among the party's top entourage under the direct control of Madame Mao, the wife of Chairman Mao. And these films were called internal reference films, some of which were lavishly dubbed in Chinese under the auspice of Modern Mao, who was one-time movie star in Shanghai and also a closeted Hollywood fan of Hollywood classics. And as I wrote in my book, why the masses were subject to revolutionary socialist films to purify their thoughts, the leaders courageously exposed themselves to the decadent capitalist spiritual pollution. In the early 1970s, there were these semi-hushed overnight marathon screenings of internal reference films at government, including military compounds, as incentives for people to endure the multi-day marathon party meetings. And so popular were these films, evening screenings frequently ran up to 7 and 8 hours straight, a practice that way kind of predated what we now call binge watch in the era of streaming. So the phenomenon of influencers and binge watch in the digital era is not the invention of Silicon Valley after all. So the third phase then saw the triumphant return of Hollywood in the mid-1990s with the overture from China to kickstart an ailing film market amidst Chinese film industry's declining domestic output and theater attendance, partly as the result of economic reform that forced the state-subsidized industry to earn a commercial living. Hollywood films, initially mostly low-budget B-movies, were permitted to officially enter China by the late 1970s, when the country reopened its door to the outside. But the revenue-sharing blockbuster films were not allowed until the mid-1990s. And upon returning, Hollywood soon swept the Chinese market as it quickly brought back audiences. And then finally, the current phase, China's recent surge as the world's largest market and China's takeover of its own domestic market since last year. One point I emphasize in my book is that Hollywood films have triggered simultaneously fascination, apprehension, resistance, and competition during both China's Republic era and the post-Mao era, the post-Mao People's Republic era. Admiration for the kind of sheer allure and market prowess of Hollywood pictures, a resistance for Hollywood's perceived historical injustice to the China image and to Hollywood's market dominance. And more recently, competition and an effort to draft Hollywood into serving China's interest, particularly China's global image campaign. And the most recent hawkish decoupling trend notwithstanding. One fascinating discovery I had in writing the book is the parallels, as well as the kind of degree of historical entanglement between Hollywood and China at various stages of development. Both the American and Chinese film industries had their roots in commercial operations, though the American film pioneers were mostly tied to the distribution exhibition business, while the Chinese film pioneers were a mixture of kind of amateur theater, cinema lovers, and also merchants. Early film industry in China pretty much emulated the American style studio model. Even the censorship regimen kind of progressed in a similar fashion in China and the US. In fact, during the Republic era, the Chinese consulted Hays Code in devising its own censorship regulations. And the paths diverged only during the Mao era, as the People's Republic of China forcibly converted the Chinese film industry from a private and decentralized model to a Soviet-style centralized and government subsidized model, while banishing Hollywood from China altogether. And the post-Mao China saw yet a reversal of the Soviet model. And the centralized and state-subsidized film industry was forced to learn how the market functioned, essentially to relearn how the market functioned, which took some laborious effort, including inviting Hollywood back to China, which reselected the Chinese film market and triggered the same kind of euphoria mixed with fear and loathing. And contentious issues such as competition, censorship, and China's defensive approach towards Hollywood have been there almost from day one. Now, let me turn to the thorny issue of China influence. And so far as motion picture is concerned, despite the increased intensity and scale of China's image campaign, the efficacy of China's projection of soft power is far from clear. Judging by the lukewarm China reception, to put it mildly, in the West, though China has wielded more influence in the developing countries, which has long been the case. And the hard power, of course, is a different matter, which I shall defer to the political scientists, international relations experts to address. And in the audiovisual sector, the business of filmmaking has been booming in China, but not necessarily the cross-cultural appeal and global recognition of Chinese films promoted by the Chinese government. China has yet to climb the global cinematic ladder in terms of prestige and popular appeal. Aside from a few independent films playing in the overseas art houses, which the Chinese government frequently disavow, and despite the overseas box office success of co-produced martial arts films of an earlier decade. The kind of incongruity of rising economic power versus the tepid cultural influence underlines China's drive to seek, indeed demand international recognition. And thus the transformation from soft power to sharp power. Therefore, you see the surge of heavy industry films showcasing China as a military power in Wolf Warrior II and Operation Red Sea, and so on and so forth. Now, only over a decade ago, in 2011, Ryan Kavanaugh, a Hollywood producer with China ambition, predicted in Beijing, quote, "There's no reason we should have Chinese films and American films anymore. There should be global films," unquote. A decade later, the Chinese-American film industries have grown apart, even as the two industries have become ever more entangled. They've really grown, ever more apart. the collusion in business continues, but the government, media, and public scrutiny from both sides makes film collaboration a really hazardous proposition. There are signs that Hollywood is pivoting away from the China stories, particularly after the failure of these films, Norman Land, Shang-Chi and the Legend of Ten Rings, and then the Black Widow, the Eternals, and Spider-Man No Way Home, etc., being securing China releases. Some in the US actually eagerly anticipates return to the business model where the US studios make mid-budget movies for American audiences rather than mega-budget actioners for the foreign market. As Sunny Bunch puts it, a world in which Chinese filmmakers make films for Chinese audiences and in which American filmmakers make films for Western audiences isn't the worst thing that could happen, quote unquote. So the question is, can Hollywood adjust without the Chinese market? Or put it differently, can Hollywood afford walking away from the Chinese market? Industries work together on non-controversial projects for mutual benefits. The same question actually applies to the other industries and economic sectors and to the Sino-US relation at large. And the recent release of Top Gun 2 can be an interesting kind of test case for Hollywood without the Chinese market and funding. So the film was initially co-financed by the Chinese internet giant Tencent. A trailer in 2019 saw our hero Maverick wearing a bomber jacket with a patch that was missing the image of the Taiwan flag in the initial film, Top Gun 1, which caused them to stir. Paramount Pictures was called out for pandering to the PRC. And the ROC flag was restored in the film's final 2022 version, which currently just, it's on the theater now. What happened between 2019 and 2022? Well, amidst the deteriorating Sino-US relation and China's domestic crackdown, Tencent withdrew its funding by the late 2019. And Paramount has since realized the challenge of getting a China green light for a film showcasing the US military might. With the pressure of the China market gone, the studio promptly restored ROC flag. Would the studio lament the loss of the Chinese market? You bet they would. Would Hollywood survive without the Chinese market? It could if it recalibrates the budget and box office expectations and make do with a kind of a final tally without the Chinese revenue. But the financial loss, of course, would be not a small matter. So kind of to wrap up, initiated almost a decade ago at this conference at Harvard. My book project started out by invoking somewhat facetiously the term courtship to describe what I saw as a fitful relationship that, however tentative and antagonistic at times, had brought two willing partners to the negotiating table in their common pursuit of prosperity and happiness, measured by the tangible box office receipts and by the less tangible notion of influence or soft power. Sino-Hollywood relation was initially more of an apprenticeship, as the two parties were by no means equal in finance, technology, and popular appeal. While guilty of flooding the global market with its brand of entertainment at the expenses of local industries and arguably identities, Hollywood has always paddled softly with plenty of charm and delight, winning the hearts and minds of the Chinese audiences. Though it continues to lead in popularity and recognition globally, the empowered Chinese film market, the Chinese film industry now wants to be a competitor. China has reached out to Europe, the Middle East, Latin America for collaborations and opening its market to non-Hollywood films. And so can China harness its economic power for cultural influence? That's a good question. And I think that both the Chinese and the US governments might underestimate the intelligence of audiences, American and Chinese. audiences gravitates towards films of their own comfort, not necessarily films promoted by the government. It remains to be seen how the two industries might continue to engage each other against the larger backdrop of the Sino-US economy. China has both the market to sell and the cash for investment. So hard for deal makers to walk away. Deals will be made, but more surreptitiously. So my book essentially serves as a swan song to an era of Hollywood fetish in China and vice versa. But I'm not forecasting the end of Hollywood in China. The cycle of boom and bust remains the norm in the motion picture business. And it's also very hard to gauge the actual state of Hollywood films in China these days, given the kind of increasingly restricted Hollywood access to the Chinese market. The lackluster reception of recent Hollywood films might only be a phase, and the fans of Hollywood might very well return to their cinematic comfort zone while conditions are ripe. So I think, I should kind of stop here, and I wanted to stick to the 20 minutes allowance, and then I think some of the issues might be teased out more thoroughly during the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you for your remarks. And I want to encourage our remote audience to submit their questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. But let me prime the pump a little bit. Reading your book actually brought back a lot of memories and things that I had not thought about in a number of years. And that is, for example, before China's accession to the WTO, how much of the discussion about trade focused on piracy of software, but also music and film. And the US-China tensions really focused on questions like that and how much the world has really changed. Now we're focused on planes violating air defense zones, and we're focused on theft of technologies. We're focused on semiconductor competition, geostrategic competition. And it's remarkable really how in 25 years, the stakes have changed so much. And also who actually dominates the conversation. There was a time where Jack Valenti of MPAA was front and center in front of Congress. There was a time where all of us had our favorite DVD stores, neighborhood stores in the cities that we were living in China, where we would get the latest Hollywood films, and periodically they would shut down whenever there was a brief enforcement drive, and you would know that they'd open up again a week or two later, and there would be these staged, mountains of DVDs in which like a bulldozer or steamroller would drive over it, and that was meant to sort of demonstrate that China was taking these issues very seriously, and in short order, things would kind of return to where they were before. And in some sense, it's kind of, I think, a metaphor for the larger relationship. But anyhow, that's sort of a walk through memory lane and things I'd not thought about in a long time. And so I really thank you for that. You are quite open in the book about the extent to which the Chinese government has always viewed film and media in general as a battlefield in the competition over politics and ideology. And I think you absolutely rightly point out that the US has also regarded film as essential to sort of disseminating American values around the world. And so there is sort of a parallelism there. If you occupy the seats in Zhongnanhai, for example, of the Communist Party, you could see how they might feel under assault by Hollywood, because Hollywood is projecting a very different view of the world. Yet your focus in the book lies elsewhere. And consequently, there's not much discussion about how the propaganda department and the apparatus in China that regulates film actually polices content, enforces censorship, and decides which films to admit into the Chinese market. I was wondering if you could supplement your presentation with some understanding of how that works for our audience.
Yeah, sure. Just so you know, so the manuscript itself is much heavier, thicker than this one. So I had to let go, I think, 1/3 to half of the material.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
and
a common problem.
It was a painful process. So I did somewhere there in the deleted part talked about the process of censorship and how censorship works and how the progression of censorship. Basically, there is a committee, censorship committee that's and composed of government bureaucrats, leaders in various cultural institutions, and so on and so forth. So they were the ones, they are the ones who continue to be the ones who are in charge. Well, they rotate, personnel rotate, but they're the ones who are being sitting there and review movies. Sometimes there's a lot of movies. And sometimes when there is a location, there will be slippage because they might, kind of miss the one or two things. And so therefore the film get released. So yeah, so there is a committee. And so the censorship regime also fluctuates in terms of how strict they reinforce that. And so they set up a rule, but they might not carry out the rule, implement the rule kind of uniformly. It has to do with, so that's the thing about the Chinese rule. That includes national security law, right? It's very ambiguous. It's written in a certain way that you can interpret it as you wish, according to the needs, right, of a particular players. So this is basically how the censorship regime works in China. Unless you want me to get into real great amount of detail, probably will just take up the entire, the rest of the time.
Well, could you say something about which kinds of American films it favors for admission into the market then?
I can tell you what films that it would not appreciate. The Top Gun suggests this, right, apparently. So in terms of the films, I think a lot of it falls into the studios, the Chinese studios or the American studios who choose certain films they think that might open in China. It has to do with their assessment of what audiences want in China, not necessarily what Chinese government want, because the film is essentially want to open big in the market. So they rely on the audiences to come in, right? So it has to do with what they see. With the films that might open wide. Of course, the film that open wide in China would be the films that either has nothing to do with China, just pure Hollywood blockbuster films. If the film is such that has anything to do with China, factoring China stories, then it has to be projecting in China in a very positive way, right? And because that has to do with the government censorship. That has, not always has to do something to do with how the viewer is perceived. So the sanitized version of Hollywood films that pertains to China will have a guaranteed release in China, that's for sure. And the demand, it could be from the government, it could also, there's a popular sentiment too. The nationalistic sentiment really runs high in China. So they also, certain segment of audiences naturally gravitates towards certain type of films.
I remember there was a time in China where there was a craze for Indians, right? And I'm wondering if you could reflect on, given the dominance of Hollywood globally, whether Hollywood is treated any differently in China than films coming from other major markets, whether it's European markets or whether it's India, for example, or even Nollywood for that matter.
So I guess depending on who is treating this, right? So Hollywood has always occupied a very special place in our imagination, right? So in the mid-1990s, right, when the Chinese film industry is in decline, the government really needed Hollywood to come in to resuscitate the Chinese market. So of course, they're not going to look for Bollywood films, Nollywood films, right? These films cannot open the Chinese market. So they need that. So here's the thing, the Chinese is not going to kind of play according to the other's rule. It plays according to what benefit me. Right, so that's how Hollywood is constantly kind of come into play in this regard too, right? They build up the Chinese market, right? So if you build it, they will come, and they do come, right? But now in the current political and cultural climate, and so the relationship is icy. So the Chinese studios consciously reached out to other providers, right? There's a very intense, actually, kind of negotiating collaboration between the Chinese film industry and the European film industries. Collaboration is more, and that seems to be a safer path now. You also have to think about it because the Chinese domestic film, studio filmmakers, they're also very cautious about, make sure they are not, getting themselves into trouble. So there's a fair amount of, I wouldn't say necessarily self-censorship, because self-censorship is such a fallacy, because you cannot have a self-censorship without censorship, right? So you're forced to censor yourself, right, but because you want to, right?
Well, that's a perfect segue to my last question before I open it up to the group here in the room and then to the larger audience. And that is, do you think that bargain, one of the most insidious things about the current and the arrangement between Hollywood and China, of course, is that China is able to wield its market power to incentivize Hollywood to internalize China's political red lines, simply for its economic interests and for the promise of access to the China market. And that's perfectly consistent with China's strategy in virtually every other domain. The Chinese government has been telling us for like 40 years now that it is consistently opening, and yet it is not yet open. And so—
we're finally getting the message.
Yeah, exactly. So do you think that bargain has worked well for Hollywood economically and artistically?
That's the thing, one of the things I want to address, I wish I could address a bit more. Film, more than political order carrying and profit kind of as a source of revenue, it's also artistic, venture. So often we really don't talk about film as art, right? And so, but that's a little a sentiment that probably does that. So in terms of Hollywood, would Hollywood benefit? Oh, you bet Hollywood has benefit economically. Yeah, China used to be the second largest market. Well, the third largest market, because this was North America and Japan, and then China moved on to the second largest market, and boom, thanks to the pandemic, and now it's the world's largest market. So yeah, the market is so huge, it can make and break a film. Of course, to Hollywood, it's a, the bottom line is the most important thing, right? It's a commercial run industry, and so yeah, it benefited tremendously from that. And what was so that's economic. What was the other question?
Artistic.
Artistically, okay, here's the thing. I'm not sure. And I'm not sure there are, a lot of, artistic, innovation in these franchising, shootout actioners to begin with. And frankly speaking, also, as I said, almost 10 years ago, almost the same time when Hollywood was having a sort of a low, was running into trouble in the Chinese market in April 2013. And so what I said at the time was, okay, Hollywood makes more than just blockbuster actioners. We have a real quality, A-class pictures, right? That kind of manufactures genuine emotional, connection, at least, right? So, and there's lots of quality films, but these films not select to be exported to China, because the myth is that, people don't want to think, the dialogues, the culture is too complicated. And this is this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, which actually undermines, in Hollywood's the long-term development in overseas market, in China as well. So the reputation of Hollywood, Hollywood is charming effortlessly, right? But, to the discerning mind, so there's a questionable taste there, right? So no, economically it benefit, artistically, they don't need a Chinese market to raise its artistic value.
Right. So please, questions are on the table. Karis.
Yeah, I don't quite know how to phrase this question, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the influence of the need for access to the mainland market on the other China film industries out there. So in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, and whether you see a shift in the kinds of topics that they take on, or the kind of production values in an effort to gain access to the mainland market, and whether there's any kind of patterns over time that you can identify.
I'm sorry, so?
Well, just more generally, the influence of the Hong Kong and Taiwan film industries, how they've reacted to the Kaifang, so the reform and opening up period.
Oh, so it's about, well, okay, so I mean, the Hong Kong and Taiwan film markets are just two different things.
Yeah.
Because also market industry are two different things too. And the market continuously exists. Well, very small market, right? The Taiwan market is very small to begin with. It's kind of minuscule, right. Inconsequential to Hollywood.
Yeah, I'm thinking more about the industry in those areas.
So industry, yeah. Okay, so industry, in terms of Hong Kong industry, it's completely decimated. There's no more Hong Kong industry per se. Once upon a time, we had a very vibrant Hong Kong cinema, right? So, but now, you're seeing the so-called, I call this, Northern Expedition. All the major players have moved to the north because the market is to the north. The finance comes from the north. So, but on the other hand, Hong Kong has, retained its, tries to strive to maintain a vibrant, independent, market, but they no longer make a real high energy. Once upon a time, this glorious, Hong Kong film industry, it's just not there anymore. It's just very sad. And in terms of Taiwan film industry, it was kind of just a more sort of artisanal, government sponsored. It's more like a European model, right? It's not a real commercial model. So it's kind of a different. Hong Kong's model is really commercial to begin with from day one, because the Hong Kong film industry is a spin-off of the Chinese Shanghai film industry, because these are the people who migrate from Shanghai and they help to fund the Hong Kong film industry. Yeah.
Please, yes.
Some assumptions. First, Hollywood is driven by money. And the Chinese market is a very important market for Hollywood. So how Hollywood has been adapting its content and topics, and how, let's say, the Chinese caveats are influencing the production. Do you have any kind of measure or index or something?
Oh, wow. So if you look online, there will be a list of, censorship to cut out and modification. It's all there. So the web, all these volunteers have done a film of contribution in terms of coming up with, this list of content modification and censorship. I think the other side of the question is about localizing, right? So how has Hollywood localized in their attempt to enter the Chinese market? Yeah, content modification. And pandering to the local taste. And so it's again, I think it's not just the government censorship, it's also the popular sentiment in China too. They have to understand or realize or imagine they know what the Chinese wants, right? Much like, so if you're not sure where the rule is, you go to the extreme. You sanitize to the extent that it just becomes ridiculous. Some of these films just make the Chinese audiences laugh. It's just, it's crazy, right? But I discovered during my course of interviews that the fans of Hollywood actually just prefer pure Hollywood films that has nothing to do with China. That's authentic Hollywood is what they want, not the modified movies that kind of haphazardly inject some Chinese elements and an image of a Chinese actor and one little tiny storyline that disappeared. There's not continuity. Just to them it's just ridiculous.
So Fan Bingbing is not the answer.
Fan Bingbing is not the answer. Fan Bingbing has disappeared, apparently. So.
Right. Yes.
Your comment about GDP growth versus cultural impact, I'd love to hear more about that. I'm sure the writer Dan Wong talks about that a lot. Just it's incongruous. You have a small country like Korea. It's taken over the world with K-pop and, the 1.2 billion people, and you don't have anything. I mean, you got TikTok, a few other, what's your view on why that is?
Well, I think, so the answer is kind of pretty much readily there, which is, to a certain extent, you might be able to manage the economy, right? But you cannot manage culture. You're suffocating the culture by trying to manage it. You put a short leash. So imagine, so can China make, are there material available and talents available for the Chinese to make, let's say, the Squid Game, right? If the policy is loosened up, but yeah, you bet. There might be, but do they dare to do that? No. Under the current situation, no. Which pretty much explains, that's the sad state of, so that, there are talents in the industry.
Is there an underground movement? Have you found that?
No, I haven't found it.
You haven't found it. I haven't either.
No. Let me know if I find it. And they probably will let you know. Right.
So we have a question actually from the audience that is perhaps a rephrasing of that, but maybe you could take it in a further direction. And that is, do you think that absent any government control, censorship, financing, if you could possibly imagine that in the PRC, that Chinese film would generate soft power for China? That if the CCP just got out of the way, that they would find success? Because there is so much artistic creativity in the PRC that is just being straitjacketed.
Yeah, you think of the success of, early in the 1980s when China first opened up, right? And so there was, China's gone through this period of loosening up and tightening and all that, right? It fluctuates so much. So, but during a period of time, it was just this cultural renaissance of some sort. And a lot of Chinese films, independent films, a lot of them won awards in European, prestigious European film festivals. So the talents are there, but can they manage all of a sudden? They're let loose. Can they manage it? I think it would take some time for them to actually do it, because there is control is one thing. There's also the habit of thought, habit of, the way of doing things, right? It will take, a fair amount of kind of adaptation, learning. Yeah.
But these directors from the 80s, they're still with us. I mean, some of them have made their choices about how to advance their careers, and others have chosen to stay true to their art. But potentially they could play a role in that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So we still have the fifth generation, Zhang Yimou, for instance, right? It continues to be very, very productive. It chooses to effortlessly work with the government and in the market, and also try to maintain some independence, right? While making other films. Oh yeah, and the young filmmakers. I think I would be looking at really watching the young generation. But it's very hard. The condition just isn't there in China now because the control is really intense.
Right. Is China, we've noticed in other media sectors, particularly news media, for example, that China is subsidizing Chinese content, particularly in the global South. In many senses, outcompeting private Western firms, like Newswire services, for example, in which Xinhua shows up and it's free essentially for a newspaper to pick up the Xinhua feed. Is China subsidizing global distribution of Chinese film? Because, for China to seize discourse power, one way to do that is to make it cheap, free, or even profitable to show Chinese films across Africa.
Okay, so the Chinese government should use you as a consultant, and unfortunately, they're not doing that. Unfortunately, they're not doing that.
I never said that.
No, so that's like I mentioned earlier, you have these small films that played very well, right, in the international market, that brought such prestige, instantly lifted the Chinese cinema and literally put the Chinese cinema in the global film map in the 1980s. But the government constantly disavow these films. So they are the major obstacle themselves towards, the so-called China cultural influence. They are standing in the way for the kind of more grassroots kind of effort of letting just, people communicate at a different level, right? So, yeah.
We have a question from the audience too about how the CCP, but also the Chinese audience perceives films in which Asian American themes are particularly prevalent. For example, Crazy Rich Asians, and what the connection is really there. And, yeah.
So if you notice that these films the American films about Asian American experience tend not to open well in China. Crazy Rich Asians. That film, yeah, Crazy Rich Asians. No, it did not did well in China. And Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon didn't do well in China either, right? So let's focus on Crazy Rich Asians. I actually talked about that, I think, in my book, right? So I think that part of the reason for this particular film, yeah, and so it does not. It's not sufficiently Western enough It's talking about the kind of imagined Crazy Rich Asians, right? And in a way that does not really connect to the Chinese back in China. So if you want to talk about Crazy Rich Asians, why don't you go to China and see Crazy Rich Chinese, right? They compete with that. And I mean, so right, so the stories they tell and the Asian American experience, let's also be very clear. Asian American experience is very different from, or Chinese American in this case, right? Because the film is really essentially about Chinese American, right? Chinese American experience is very different from Chinese back in China. And it just doesn't connect in the same level. It doesn't resonate, right?
Okay. We have a question here, if you could reflect on the changing representations of China in Hollywood over the 4 historical periods that you map. That's a very big topic, but I think it's an important one.
So notice I mentioned that, during the Republic era, right, the Chiang Kai-shek government was just very reactive. They put on the kind of defense. They're just very active. They just try to, so there will be films that, portrays China in a not particularly flatly way, right? So, and you will have commentators protest, and that will lead to the government to issue some regulatories and so on and so forth, right? There'll be some punishment, and so this is how the government during the Republic era reacted. So I mentioned that I use this term proactive, and that's important because the Chinese government were really proactive. They're just at the forefront. They kind of trying to forestall any influence. So which is why they wanted to eradicate U.S. cultural influence in the 1950s. Well, initially they had reservations, right? I wrote about that. It's kind of very, very interesting. The government is very clear because you have so many Hollywood fans who just want to have Hollywood films. You can't ban it altogether. And then, but they did. They were tough. They just kind of eradicated, banned it altogether. You would have entire several decades, right, without any presence of Hollywood film. Well, at least in the open market. Like I said, under the under the table there are kind of series of classical Hollywood films being screened here and there, right? And actually, I think could you remind me the second part of the question?
Yeah, so the representations, really, how China, the framing of China and presentation of China has changed over time.
Right, thank you. So because of the proactive approach, right? So that means when Hollywood returned to China, when Hollywood realized that China has such a big market, we try to do stories that can enter China, can let me go into China, and they modify their content. So gone are, the previous sort of kind of ambiguous images that are clear or just pure negative, right? So they're trying to sanitize these these films. So absolutely there is a content modification. Gets back to the same question.
I mean, it's quite striking if you just, for example, look at the James Bond series, right? We always had Soviet villains in the first few decades of the James Bond movies. We have no comparable, representation of China in the latter sort of segments of the James Bond franchise. And yet China is the great geopolitical competitor of the United States now. So I think that speaks to what.
Let's see what happens now that Top Gun has demonstrated that you can make do without a Chinese market. Let's see what happens. And also Hollywood also need to demonstrate, which side you're on.
Yeah.
So let's see that. So this is a very interesting test case. But of course, that means you're just basically disregard that market altogether. That's it. But I do believe there are certain films that can transcend these cultural political kind of divide. I do hope that we can continue to nurture that. I don't think decoupling is the way to go.
Do we have other questions from around the table? Carlos?
So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about animated films. So like Mulan or Kung Fu Panda, or there's a whole series of those that came out in the last 20 years, whether those are less geopolitically sensitive, whether they have a better reception in the PRC, or whether you think that also is kind of a casualty of rising geopolitical tensions.
Well, I guess if you use animations that are really human to tell the same story, would that kind of somehow mute its Mulan did not open particularly well in China. Well, all the Mulan films. So I just wonder why would Disney continue to ban, pick up the dead horse. So I keep on going with Mulan did not do well. But you're right. But animation somehow is more benign. Looks more innocent. It does have a way of kind of it can become one or two slippers, going through. And it's also not as expensive because it does not have to employ real, big stars. Although you do have to have big stars to do the voiceover, but the budget's not the same. And that could be interesting. Although so far I haven't seen a real, aside from Kung Fu Panda, I haven't
Kung
seen.
Fu Panda did well.
Kung Fu Panda did well. Oh yeah, I was in China. The Kung Fu Panda opened, so the Chinese were just, oh wow, so only the Americans can come up with the China story that's this good.
Yeah, there's a lot of soul searching in China about why can Americans make this movie and we can't.
Well, so like my colleague, I think Stanley Rosen kind of mentioned once, it's because no China would dare to portray China as the fat panda because of that. So that's a fair amount of self-censorship there. Right. So that's the vicissitude of the censorship itself, because you're just so afraid. You don't know where the line is. Yeah. And you're just kind of like a blind, mouse running around trying to figure it out. And that is the real fear. That's the real terror, I think, is you don't know where the line is. And you think that you might hit the line, right? And it's a torturous, experience. For filmmakers and for many others, I think.
Right. Is your book going to be published in China?
I don't think so. I don't know. I hope they will, but I'm not sure. I highly doubt. And yeah, so for 2 Billion Eyes, when my 2 Billion Eyes first came out, and I did have a publisher come to me that was very eager to publish. And then pretty soon, I think that they actually read it, and probably they say, oh no, there's certain things that you can't do. Which is sad because the book is really, I think it's a historical account. And I think it's just very level-headed.
One of the themes that emerges in the book is that China's engagement with Hollywood has also changed. You had the big, Chinese conglomerates like Anbang and, for example, Wanda and others who came shopping for trophy studios once upon a time in the AMC theater chain, right? And that was a function of a particular moment in time and a particular firm structure in China, right? They went shopping for a lot of assets, none of which went together in any meaningful way, right? But now we're at a model where they're no longer buying studios outright and rather engaging in sort of a la carte financing of individual films. And I wonder if that particular model offers us some hope and some flexibility for engagement short of decoupling, in which Chinese financiers can say, okay, we pass on that project because Top Gun, there's a ROC flag, we can't touch that, but we can do another project. And so, and that works in the interests of both parties so that Hollywood can continue to make films where it doesn't have to compromise whatever it wants to do with the film in order to please the Chinese market or a Chinese financer. Your thoughts on that question?
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely the way to go. Initially, I was going to talk about that, but it's 20 minutes time limit. Oh, absolutely. So this is where the deals are continue to be very robust. You think that people are just not doing anything. No, people are doing it. You just, I met so many people who everybody wants to get into the Sino-Hollywood boat. Because the potential is just huge. Oh, absolutely, but everybody's hushed. And so that is precisely the way to do it, is to use your term a la carte way, right? So you just do particular project-based approach. And so you do packaging, and depending on the outcome of the film, a Chinese can be a financer, but the Chinese can also be the one who try to get the films back to the Chinese market, right? If you actually goes back to look at all these recent, Academy Award films, American films, they all have Chinese finance. Most of them, they do. So this is also a way during that stage for the Chinese company to establish their reputation, their credential that I finance these films, right? It doesn't matter whether they open in China or not. but they won an award. So that will lead to some other things. Oh, absolutely. Oh, it's not going to stop. The Sino-Hollywood is just not going to be, pompous and making all these big announcements. And the era of Wanda is over.
We had a question at the end of the table.
Oh, yes. I was just curious about if you have any comments on how COVID changed the political economy of Hollywood calculations in terms of whether to enter China. Like, I remember even though China was early to open up, their film theaters were closed for a very long time. I think until late 2020 or something like that. So also I assume a lot of theaters are closed right now in China as well because of the COVID outbreaks. So are there changes because of that?
During the first wave of the onslaught of COVID, actually the Chinese film industry, the Chinese film market actually emerged better than Hollywood because they opened up, they managed early, right? They contained the infection and the market kind of opened and rebounded. That was the year, thanks to COVID, really, that was the year that China kind of emerged to be the largest film market because Hollywood just kind of, COVID basically decimated the Hollywood market, right? The North American market. So the Chinese film actually benefited from that. And so what was the second part of the question? I think there's other.
A lot of, I guess, theaters were closed in China as well during in 2020, but also right now because.
Well, so right now there's a second crackdown, right? So we had this interesting 3 months lockdown in Shanghai, right? And now we're talking about a lockdown in Beijing. And so, yeah, theater. So there is a precipitous drop in box office recently. Absolutely. Pandemic is a kind of double-edged sword for both Hollywood and China. It also actually given Chinese government an excuse to restrict Hollywood's, access to Chinese market.
I wanted to close with a question we think a lot about in the context of Shark Power, and it's the zone of gray zone activity in between explicit censorship from SARFT and the propaganda department, the zone that the United Front occupies. And I was wondering if you could touch on your sense in the research that you did of the extent to which just pure commerce is driving the activity of the Chinese participants in the Hollywood-China relationship, and how active United Front activity is to, or how responsive the Chinese participants need to be to United Front mandates that are issued back home.
You're talking about United Front as the agency, the organization, or as the kind of Roger metaphor?
Well, both.
I'm not sure the Chinese film industry needs the United Front. They actually, for them to survive, to do better, they need the United Front to get out of the way. They do okay without that, right? The kind of meddlesome. In terms of, United Front is not really actively engaged in that, but United Front was quite active in Hong Kong during the transitional period, 1960s, 1970s, right? So, and they were very active. So they actually have a few China-backed, PRC-backed studios who actively worked with the United Front, producing some of the very interesting films. Right? An Hui, for instance, right? This very renowned female filmmaker who actually worked with Bluebird, one of the United Front-backed studios, and they made some interesting films. So there's Hong Kong. I'm sorry, I also need to remind me again.
Well, in the U.S. market, in Hollywood.
Okay. So the other aspect is about the metaphor. So in terms of U.S. market, no, there isn't a United Front as an agency there to be part of. You don't need that because there is a
it's happening in Beijing.
Administration of propaganda, administration of film and TV and radio, all that, right? The regulators, you don't need that. And they also have the local agencies, actually. They have local agencies. They have local Chinese government distribution studios. They have companies, right, in Los Angeles. So they are the ones always in charge of the collaborations and selecting Hollywood films. And once upon that, actually, nowadays they don't function. So we don't really see the strong presence of United Front. But the United Front as a metaphor, well, I guess who's United Front, right? And so that's the question. I mean, United Front on behalf of whom? 1.2 billion Chinese people, in the government compound, and what is the word for these the pink ladies or whatever, the very ultra nationalistic youth. I mean, who's United Front? There isn't a United Front. That is a metaphor. China's big. China has many shades. China's is not monolithic. Neither is Chinese film industry. If you look at Chinese film industry, it produces a cluster of different films, much like Hollywood. There's blockbuster films, propaganda, and there's small scale art films. There's also mainstream commercial films, which we in the West often tend to kind of overlook to our own disadvantage.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Professor Zhu, very much for your conversation and for your insights into the film industry. I want to alert our audience and those of you here in the room that on June 7th at 2 p.m. Pacific, we welcome you to Banking on Beijing, the Aims and Impacts of China's Overseas Development Program, where Dr. Brad Parks from the Aid Data Lab at the College of William & Mary will discuss a monumental new study he co-authored on China's overseas development assistance. As many of you know, China's ODA is having a transformational economic and political impact across the globe, particularly in Africa, Latin America, and soon perhaps in the South Pacific. So you won't want to miss that. We'll see you then. Thank you.